Okay, you guys, so this is probably the only class I've given to you in the whole 30 days, so it feels kind of weird. In any case, let's get started. This is our overview for the entire course. So what I've done is taken an excerpt from a book called The Scarlet Letter by an American author, Nathaniel Hawthorne. This was written in the 1800s. So it's a classic. Okay, so here we have our article, the. And I noted up here that the is an article used for a specific person. This the is talking about the minister here, which is a noun. That's talking about a specific minister, which is the one in the book. The wretched minister. Wretched is an adjective. I'll read the next sentence. He had made a bargain very like it. The subject pronoun is he. The verb phrase is had made. And this article, is talking about the direct object noun, which is bargain. So it's not as specific. You don't know exactly what bargain they're talking about, so that's why you don't use the here. You wouldn't say he had made the bargain very like it, because it's not a specific bargain. They're talking about something that's unspecific. So he had made a bargain very like it. Very like it is talking about bargain. So very like it is considered the adjective, and because it's more than one word, it's an adjective phrase, and it modifies or talks about the word bargain. Next sentence. Tempted by a dream of happiness. Okay, all of that is actually an adverbial phrase because it's talking about the verb in the sentence. Tempted by a dream of happiness, he had yielded himself. Had yielded, so tempted by a dream of happiness is talking about had yielded, which is a verb phrase. The subject pronoun in the sentence is he. Had yielded himself is the direct object. So tempted by a dream of happiness is talking about had yielded. If you notice, there's a verb up here too, tempted. That's one of the clues that this is actually an adverbial phrase and not an adjective phrase. Tempted by a dream of happiness, he had yielded himself with deliberate choice. With deliberate choice. Okay, that's also talking about had yielded, so it is also an adverbial phrase. As he had never done before. It's also talking about had yielded. Okay, so he had yielded because he was tempted by a dream of happiness. He had yielded, but with deliberate choice. He had yielded as he had never done before. All those are adverbial phrases. As he had never done before, with deliberate choice, tempted by a dream of happiness. And the end of the sentence, to what he knew was deadly sin. Okay, that's also an adverbial phrase. He had yielded to what he knew was deadly sin. Ay, pobrecito. And the infectious poison of that sin, sin is the subject noun. All that stuff that's come before is pretty much talking about sin. It's an infectious poison. Poison is a noun. It's modified by infectious. Infectious is talking about the poison. And both of those two together are an adjective phrase. They're talking about sin, the infectious poison of that sin. But in the sentence, you can't just say the, of course we need the because it's specific. We're talking about a specific poison, an infectious poison. But you can't just say the infectious poison sin. You can't just say the infectious poison sin. You have to have some words in between there. and the infectious poison of that sin had been thus rapidly diffused. Had been diffused is the verb phrase. So all of that's the verb, had been diffused. What had been diffused? Sin had been diffused. So had been diffused is the verb phrase of the sentence. Thus rapidly is an adverbial phrase talking about the verb phrase. Had been diffused. And thus rapidly, this part right in here, it interrupts the verb phrase because it's talking about had been diffused. And that's just something that can happen sometimes. You'll have to learn it as you read and go along. You'll see what things can be put in between the verbs in the verb phrase and what things cannot. Throughout his moral system, that's also an adverbial phrase. It's talking about had been diffused. So had been diffused rapidly. How? Rapidly. Thus rapidly. That's a verb phrase, adverbial phrase. Had been diffused. Where? Throughout his moral system. Had been diffused throughout his moral system. So throughout his moral system is the adverbial phrase talking about had been diffused. It had stupefied all blessed impulses and awakened into vivid life the whole brotherhood of bad ones. In this sentence, it is the subject, that's the subject pronoun. Had stupefied is the verb phrase. Stupefied means not stupid, it means like something has become stuck in its track and is in a daze, right? Stupefied is like you're in a state of shock. You're stuck in one place, you're in a daze. That's stupefied. It doesn't necessarily mean stupid, but it means like you're in a daze. You're in shock. You don't really know what's going on. You're stuck. So it had stupefied all blessed impulses. Had stupefied what? Over here, the direct object, impulses. It stupefied impulses, his impulses. All blessed is an adjective phrase talking about impulses. What kind of impulses? All blessed impulses. So this is the direct object over here, this word, impulses. It had stupefied impulses. And to read the whole thing, it had stupefied all blessed impulses and awakened into vivid life. Into vivid life is an adverbial phrase which is talking about awakened. And awakened into vivid life the whole brotherhood of bad ones. Ones is the direct object of awakened. It awakened what? Ones. Okay, so this is not totally a compound sentence because there's no subject after and. Whereas normally if you had a subject right here, if they just put it here, if the author had just put it here, this would be a compound sentence. You would have it as the subject pronoun again, and then awakened as the verb. This part is the adverbial phrase, and this part is the adjective phrase, and ones is the direct object. That's just letting you know. I'm trying to show you how all this information that I've shown you since day one of the class, how it's actually used, how it all comes together, and I hope this is helping. It had stupefied all blessed impulses and awakened into vivid life the whole brotherhood of bad ones. Scorn, a noun, bitterness, unprovoked malignity. These are all nouns talking about what this brotherhood is of bad impulses. Scorn, bitterness, unprovoked malignity. Malignity means like, in science, a cancerous tumor is malignant, something that's almost evil and going to try to take over other things. So if you imagine a cancerous tumor, malignity, that's a noun. Unprovoked is the adjective that talks about malignity. Unprovoked malignity, so someone who's being like trying to devour other people or being evil, but nothing was done to that person to act like that. Scorn, bitterness, unprovoked malignity, gratuitous desire of ill. Gratuitous, like you just want to do it freely. Freely, you really want to wish bad on people all the time. That's what that means. Gratuitous desire of ill. Ridicule. So gratuitous is an adjective. It's modifying desire. You see I got a little bit turned around in here? So sometimes adjectives and adverbs do get a little bit mixed up because if you take a word as an adjective, it can change the meaning of the sentence. But if you take the word as an adverb, it can change the meaning of the sentence also. So anyway, I got a little bit turned around and there was such all the scratch marks. But that's an adjective. Gratuitous desire of ill. Ridicule of whatever was good and holy. This is your adjective phrase talking about the ridicules. These are all things that this poor minister that he's finding in himself after he commits a bad deed, right? Or just has the intention to do it. All awoke, verb, all awoke to tempt, is an adverbial phrase that modifies awoke, to tempt, even while they frightened him. So this whole thing, to tempt even while they frightened him, is all of that is talking about awoke. So this whole thing is an adverbial phrase. All awoke to tempt even while they frightened him. One more page. Okay, this cuts to Hester. During all this time, Hester stood, statue-like, at the foot of the scaffold. During all this time is an adverbial phrase that's talking about or modifying stood. During all this time, you could say she stood. Hester stood. So Hester is the subject noun. Stood is the verb. Statue-like is the adverb. It's talking about how she stood. So statue-like is the adverb talking about how she stood. So stood how? Statue-like. At the foot of the scaffold. This is an adverbial phrase, this whole thing, talking about where she stood. Stood at the foot of the scaffold. So there's three adverbs in here. During all this time, she stood. During all this time, she stood statue-like. During all this time, Hester stood statue-like. Where? At the foot of the scaffold. Oh, I want to show you an if-would sentence. If the minister's voice had not kept her there would nevertheless have been an inevitable magnetism in that spot. So you have the if and would. It's hypothetical. If the minister's voice had not kept her there would nevertheless have been an inevitable magnetism in that spot. Had not kept her there as a verb phrase. I'm not going to go into this, what all of this is, because we didn't talk about that in the class. Had not kept her there as a verb phrase. Had not kept who? Her is the direct object pronoun there. There would nevertheless have been. The verb phrase is would have been. Nevertheless is interrupting the verb phrase. There would nevertheless have been. You could also put nevertheless before the verb phrase. There nevertheless would have been. An inevitable magnetism. Magnetism is the direct object noun here, in this part, down here. To nevertheless would have been magnetism. What's talking about magnetism? Inevitable is the adjective. Inevitable magnetism. So inevitable is describing magnetism. Inevitable is something that's bound to happen, something that's gonna happen, whether you want it to happen or not. Inevitable. Magnetism is like a magnet, something that is drawing you. Okay, so the voice is drawing her, keeping her in that spot. In that spot is the adverbial phrase that's talking about would have been. Describing would have been in that spot. Whence she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy. All of this is also an adverbial phrase that's modifying in that spot. In that spot, whence she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy. Yeah. So when she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy is talking about in that spot. Whence is the old way of saying where. It's talking about in that spot. Where's the other one? Oh, that's what I wanted to say. Because one adverbial phrase can modify another. Don't you love English? So when she dated the first hour of her life of ignominy is an adverbial phrase that's modifying in that spot, which is another adverbial phrase. And in that spot is talking about would have been. Okay, so I hope this helps you guys a little bit. If there's any questions, please let me know. I'm going to try to type this out maybe a little bit later, but for now I'll take pictures of those pages. Thank you.